This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Steve Blank, Silicon Valley entrepreneur out of California. He's quite well known, especially for something he developed, the customer development method, which was really the launch of the lean startup movement. Today, Steve comes on to talk about something that he just wrote, which I think is a really important topic: the virus survival strategy for your startup. Now, our conversation goes beyond startup, essentially the virus survival strategy for your business. But this is something that you need to hear. This is a thought process that you need to understand. Steve has great wisdom. He's seen a lot of different environments. And if you've not experienced an environment like we are facing right now, Steve brings great insights. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Steve Blank. We have just seen the markets close for March 2020, the end of March. Man, has there ever been a month like that?
1929.
But they didn't have the virus.
No. So this is the first engineered economic downturn. Everything else was some fundamentals or some tulip bubble popping or whatever. This one's consciously designed to save hundreds of thousands or millions of lives. And we've decided to shut down the economy to do that.
Do you think when we have time to reflect, it's going to always be hard because there's going to be a great debate, I can imagine, in the future, considering we were in a 10-year bull run with very low interest rates, which a lot of people might argue was good leverage on the system, that we had the virus show up right at the wrong time in the market cycle?
One can make lots of arguments that if it would have showed up in 2008, it just would have driven the Great Recession into a depression. You could argue either side of it. There is no right time for a pandemic. And again, there is no right time for consciously shutting down 3/4 of your economy.
When did you first realize, because I've got all your writings about what's been going on in the last 60 days or so in front of me, when did you first have that feeling in your stomach? Was it an internal thing that just from years and years of experience that you had yourself? Was it conversations with other people? When did you first have that moment of, oh my blank, this is going to go off the rails?
Yeah, I think I started writing about it in the beginning of March. We started isolating 3 weeks ago. Not like February, but it wasn't like we were prescient. But I think we took it a little more seriously than people did at the time. And I think it was just fairly evident, at least to me, that once you start shutting things down, restaurants are gone, travel's gone, hospitality's gone, all the ripple effects up and down the economy. Startups are going to be affected. Some parts of the economy are going to boom, remote learning, et cetera, but they're not going to make up for the jobs that are going to be lost. And then if you look at the CARES Act, the Economic Stimulus Act, it's still corporate welfare, not job preservation. There's very little limits about how much of that goes into pumping up shareholder returns versus saving jobs and saving the economy. But I'm not an economic expert. I mean, I only kind of look at the startup and sometimes the government and corporate side. But it seems pretty obvious that this is going to have some long-term ripple effects way past this year.
Yeah, that's the real struggle, is trying to lay a groundwork, lay a plan for the future when there's so much uncertainty. And I think a lot of people are probably just sitting back and saying, well, let me just wait this out and it'll all bounce back like it was before. But man, your writings about recovery, about what happens to current business models, et cetera, you are pulling no punches. You are very, very sober.
Well, it's just one opinion, but mine is particularly if you don't have 18 months to 2 years of cash in the bank, or even worse, if you were early stage venture cash flow negative, or even a small business that was teetering from payroll to payroll, you need to make some immediate decisions, or else the market and the economy are going to make them for you. And in some cases, they have. I mean, when they shut down your business is shut. I mean, that's been done for you, but the payroll and rent and what other fixed expenses you have are still there. What I've been telling people is you immediately need to do a external and internal assessment, kind of get a lay of the land. Externally, what the heck's going on? Is social distancing already happening in your state or community, or is it, if not, it's going to come? What's your prediction about the economy this quarter and for the next 5 quarters? Internally, how much cash do we have? If we're selling to companies, are they still in business? If our customers were the airlines or hotels or anything else, I don't care what your VP of sales said the second quarter forecast is, throw it out the window. You personally, as a CEO, need to get on the phone and start making calls yourself. And then the CARES Act did have some interesting things for small businesses. Payroll Protection Act attempted to save jobs for companies under 500 people, but it's questionable whether they actually thought about startups, because they're saying if VCs invested in them, if the aggregate employees exceed 500, it may not apply. But at least for small businesses. But the problem is the banks aren't doing that yet. So if you've got a payroll to make, there is no check today. So you need to take immediate assessment. What's going on outside? When do you think it's going to recover? My prediction is you're not going to see a normal economy for at least a year. And obviously different parts of the economy will recover at different rates. Then what's your cash situation? What's your sales situation? Are your customers still in business? By the way, you need to check that. Here's our assessment. Go check it with your investors or your board. Hopefully they're seeing things past just your company, and maybe they have other insights that you don't. Most likely, if they're paying attention, they do, and you could kind of plug those into what's going on. That should take no more than a day or two, and it should be done by you and your if you are a large enough company, you and your C-level staff, your CFO, your VP of sales, etc. And then you need to get to what's the plan. And the plan is, well, what's our new business model? Whatever business model you had at the 1st of March, like, hello, what rock have you been under? That's no longer valid. Maybe you're in the small group of companies where, in fact, orders are coming in so fast you can't keep up. Congratulations. But if you're the rest of the economy, that business model is just no longer true. So what is true? Have our customers changed? Should we pivot from these customers to this customer? Gee, if we had enterprise software, should we go to this segment because they're still in business and just stop calling on these people? I mean, or gee, if we had brick and mortar stores, can we repurpose them to something else? If it's not the same, life today is just not the same. And in this case, the reconfiguring your business model, unlike the assessment, which should be done by the C-level staff, I would open this up to everybody in the company. If anybody has a good idea, let's hear it, but we're not going to set up committees to schedule the committee, to have the conference room, to have the meeting, to have 20 people sign off. We're going to do this in a couple of days. And part of this is figuring out how to manage our cash. What are our fixed expenses? Well, it used to be fixed expenses were just what they said. They were fixed. You can't change them. Those rules are out. Go call your landlords if you have buildings you're renting and say, we'll pay you in 90 days or we'll pay you half or something. But you need to be able to preserve cash to keep your business alive. As I said, if you're the type of business that was either cash flow negative or teetering, the same with all the other fixed expenses. And then figure out, typically in companies, is one of the biggest expense lines are people. Are you going to need to do layoffs? And if so, the first thing you ought to be considering, and in fact, I would strongly suggest, is that the entire C-level needs to take an immediate pay cut, at least 30%, if not more. If you're going to lay off a single person, the first people it ought to hit are those who are staying, to preserve the jobs of as many people as you can. And then you need to figure out what's the plan. And this shouldn't take weeks. This should take days. And then finally, you need to execute. And the toughest part is, as I said, sometimes it comes down to layoffs. But having lived through this a couple of times, the worst thing you could do is slice the salami thinly. Oh, we'll lay off 5%. Then 2 weeks later, you realize, we should have done another 5%, then another 5%. It turns out when you do that, you demoralize everybody. Productivity drops to almost zero because everybody's looking over their shoulder, figuring out who's next. And what you should have done is just simply taken an axe to survival because you're working on a lifeboat strategy. You're not rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. You're filling up the lifeboat because this thing is going down. And then the thing you want to think about is, well, eventually there will be a recovery. That is, there will be a morning after here. It's only a question of when. And so what assets do you not want to throw out that you're going to need when growth does come? Is it people? Is it technology? Is it a physical plant? Don't toss everything out, because when you do start to grow, have a competitive edge and be able to grow fast. So that's the 5-day playbook in about 5 minutes. Any of that make sense?
I'm sure most of the people that are going to be listening are be like, okay, I can't really argue with that. I didn't really want to hear that, but instinctively, intuitively, everyone has to admit that's a pretty damn good argument. And the ripple effects of all of this, when you lay that scenario out over 5 minutes and you start to think about the ripple effects, I'm in an Asian city right now. I mean, they basically, all tourism, all hotels, etc., were scuttled 45 days ago. Right now, the states, okay, we've got this talk of, quote, bailouts and the government stepping up to some degree, arguments whether it's good or bad, enough or not. But my gosh, the rest of the world, I think we also have to imagine, for example, if you're a U.S. company, what's going to happen to the rest of the world? Because they're not going to get a lot of this, quote, bailout. They're not going to get it from their home countries. Some of these countries can't pull this off.
That's why I suggest that companies take this seriously now and think about what the plan is, or it's just going to happen to them. And this isn't to be cruel. You could either stay on the ship and everybody loses their job, or you could figure out how to build something that survives while being compassionate and taking care of the least. When I'm talking about layoffs, there's a lot of subtlety here. It's not only the C-level staff need to take a big haircut, but you need to take care of the most vulnerable people that you have. As engineers will find another job. Janitors or people who are lower level jobs are actually the ones most at risk of permanently being damaged by this. The other thing you ought to be doing is that if you've assigned most of your people to work at home, you ought to be paying for upgraded equipment or network if they need it, but also remote therapy or whatever else. I mean, I'm sure most of your listeners are a little more stressed, which is an understatement now than they were a month ago. Companies not appreciating that and providing resources to that are a little short-sighted. Yeah, this is going to have ripple effects up and down. You talk about closing hotels. Well, the laundries close. All the food services close. All the suppliers to the hotels. Think about every supplier to that hotel no longer has customers. And those people are going to be laying off people. And those people buy in grocery stores and other places. So even as China is recovering, Americans aren't buying as much anymore. Oops. Their factories could get back up, but their customers aren't going to be there, at least in the volume they had. This thing could, if we're not careful, can actually trip into the worst case, into a global recession, if not a depression, depending on how long the shutdown happens and its impact of the number of people it kills.
Steve, you're a guy that can game this out in many different ways, and you've laid the scenario out that, okay, hopefully we will be back to normal in a year. But can you see scenarios that are much longer than a year? I mean, you just mentioned the D word.
Yep. I mean, what your listeners should know, and I'm sure they do, is no one knows. No one knows. Social distancing works. This will be over in 3 months, and the economy will sputter back. And within a year, we'll not remember, or we'll remember this, but we'll be recovered. If this gets out of control, and God forbid, 1 million or 2 people die in the U.S., and Italy and in Spain and Europe follow the same path, we will be in a depression, and it will last multiple years. But no one knows. And what's really interesting is that it's really up to us. I mean, this one we have control over. How hard is it to sit on your couch? I mean, I appreciate some people have small children and they're climbing the walls, but the alternative are worldwide millions of people dead. It's the only time we can actually control the outcome here of not only the economy, but the lives of millions of people. Kind of interesting. Like, God damn it, watch some more Netflix. This is only the other time that I would suggest is most of the time, if you're a young entrepreneur or a business person, you mostly kind of roll your eyes when somebody with gray hair tries to give you advice. On this one, having lived through 3 or 4 recessions, you might want to be paying attention to multiple gray-haired people, not because they're smarter, but they just might have said, I've seen some of this before. No one's seen this one exactly, but we have lived through recessions when, for the last 12 years, if you think about it, if you're a young entrepreneur or investor, the only way you know the market and money to go is up. Well, a lot of us have lived through when that went the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a whole generation of people that only know from March of '09 to today, and that's looked pretty rosy.
So those days are over for a while. And as I said, if you're a startup, don't be surprised if you're in a certain set of segments that the funding you thought that was there March 15th has just completely disappeared. My generic advice to anybody in startup land is if people are offering you money, take it. And if it's no longer at that bubble valuation, still take it, as long as it could help you survive the next year or two. But the bad news is that in every economic downturn, it brings out the vulture capitalists and bad behavior on VCs. As I said, their VCs are pulling term sheets and doing down rounds. Entrepreneurs will remember who they are, but take their money.
Let me pick your mind a little bit about, you brought it up, stress, isolation. One thing I've noticed too in conversations with friends and family, especially in, let's say, mid-March, when it was kind of really just happening fast on the markets, I noticed quite a few boomers I was having conversations with, and they weren't registering yet what was happening with the economy in terms of the forced shutdown or the corona, but I could feel their stress on their retirement accounts. It was like just staring at the retirement accounts isn't going to make them come back up. It's like we are where we are now today. No one knows, as you say, no one knows what's going to happen next, but that stress is kind of like, okay, now we're looking at potential major job losses. But we're also looking at a situation where a generation, the boomer generation that's looking to kind of retire, chill out some, they've just lost a lot of money.
I just want to put it in perspective. It's a long time ago. And the dot-com crash, I had retired the day before my company went public. And if I remember, it peaked after I left at 180 on the stock market. And I remember it got sold when the stock was at 4.5. And that was a successful company. For everybody looking at their portfolio, I would just assume that the number is at least cut in half. And then you'll feel a little better, because then as it starts approaching that number, you know it might settle there if you're lucky. But I have lived through stock prices being fractions of what they were and portfolios being fractions. People went bankrupt in 2008, and lots of people went bankrupt in the dot-com crash in 2001. Might happen again. But if you were just leaving college in 2008 and everything's been rosy so far, now you're about to get some gray hairs. We all don't deserve it, but market's cyclical, and now you're about to experience what that feels like.
Yeah, you can hear it in your voice. It's the word nimble. No matter what the market situation is, you have to adjust. And I think as you're saying, well, gosh, some of you young folks might not want to listen to some of us folks with the gray hairs, but those gray hairs give you that kind of understanding about being nimble. And that's what you're telling my audience right now is like, hey, look, yesterday's gone. You have to be with today.
A couple of things. One is you have to be with today. If you're managing a company that doesn't have 18 months to 24 months of cash flow, you need to take action, or action is going to take you. Two is don't obsess your portfolio. Just assume it's half of what you had the 1st of March. Third is there will be a morning after. And in fact, Google and Amazon and others kind of made it through these crashes, and there will be new ventures funded in the middle of this. Some companies will come out the other side stronger and better. It's just that you need to figure out how to manage through the crisis, both personally and professionally. And the personal stuff is really important. You need to stay healthy mentally. You need to have your eye on what's it take to do that for you, for your family. I mean, think about the order of stuff. You need to keep yourself healthy, both mentally and physically. You need to keep your family healthy and mentally and physically, and your extended family. And then you need to worry about your company and the people who work for you, because you're responsible for the same thing. So how do you do that? Well, number one is you need to not have stuff happen to you, even though a lot of it's out of your control. A lot of it is in your control. Keeping healthy certainly is, and having a plan, even though maybe the plan doesn't work, but you need a plan.
Let me shift you a little bit. Do you have some thoughts you might want to share? For example, I've got a nephew who just had his last couple months of his senior year of high school canceled in the state of Virginia. There's a lot of kids that are really coming along at a really interesting time. Imagine all these high school seniors or whatever educational level, and they can't finish. Can you speak to some folks out there about ideas that they might want to consider, alternatives to get around this situation if they've got young people, high school, college? Can you speak to that some?
One of the things I've been thinking about is right now everybody's kind of at heads down thinking about how do I deal with online stuff, or how do I stay entertained or finish my classes. But I just want to remind people who didn't live through it. After 9/11, a lot of people realized that there was more to life than just serving themselves, and they decided to volunteer to serve others. The people I've now worked with in the government, a good number, and in fact, an extraordinary number, joined right after 9/11 because they wanted to help their country. When people get time, I think they might start thinking about, how do I want to spend the rest of my life? Do I want to still write fart apps or entertainment apps? Fine. But are there bigger callings I might want to do? You see people working on the front lines and making masks and ventilators, or you see people, my daughter's a healthcare professional. She's still out there. We kind of think of tech as hardware and software, but there's a whole nother set of tech that is almost a completely different world, but that's life sciences. Might entrepreneurs kind of be more amenable to thinking about those types of startups or those types of businesses? I think this might be a time to start thinking about whatever career path you thought you had 1st of March. Are you sure that's the one you really want to spend the next 20 or 30 years doing? So many hours in your life. You want to make sure they're well spent.
Yeah, that's well said. I was thinking about the educational part that I brought up as you were talking. It's like, okay, if we've got the current classroom situation and something happens unexpected, like right now, it sure seems like in 2020, we should have the ability to pivot within seconds to send all kids home and say, you know what, for the next 2 or 3 months, we're going to finish the school year at home. Unfortunately, we weren't prepared for that in 2020, and I think we really should have been. And I think maybe that gets at a little bit of your point, which is like, okay, let's be prepared for that in the future. Let's try and make sure that a bunch of young kids that really it's past their pay grade, the complexities of all this, that they don't get stuck in the crosshairs just because perhaps us adults didn't really think through all the possibilities that we probably should have. We should have probably been able to pivot and send most kids home and let them work from home, I would think.
Yeah, I'm not sure anybody was prepared for shutting down every college and university in the country and every K through 12. That might have been an unreasonable expectation. I would actually observe the opposite, just have a few data points. But I think as a country, we're doing pretty good being able to do that pivot within a month or so. I mean, I'm sure it's uneven across a whole set of schools, but the fact that we could go to remote education is going to have some lasting effects. If I was a startup in this space, that might be where I might want to be putting some money and energy, because we're now exposing a whole ton of students and a whole ton of educators to the benefits of doing that. I think if you're a student who's signed up, though, for a university and they're still charging you full tuition, that's another question is, wait a minute, big chunk of going to school, at least to a college or university, is part of that social network. And that's the part that's missing. But as far as should we have been prepared to sending the whole country home to go online for school? I don't think so. Are we doing a pretty good job? I think surprisingly, the technology and the tools are mostly there to do that. That's, I think, a story that you might want to spend more time on, not with me, but somebody on who are domain experts in that area, is that, did we really do as well as I think we're doing?
I would be amiss, since you kind of opened up the idea a little bit, I'd be amiss to not pick your mind about general areas that people can consider. We've kind of talked about online, we've talked about education, but now that we are kind of on day one, so to speak, of a whole new world, if you might want to share some ideas and thoughts about the changes, because as we mentioned earlier, business model you had a month ago might not be valid anymore. Are there any general areas beyond the ones we've talked about that you start to think about with you and your colleagues about what's probably going to unfold given this new situation?
Well, I think some rules about telemedicine have changed forever. I mean, the FDA has now relaxed a ton of guidelines. that allow doctors to do remote diagnostics across states about Medicare reimbursement for those types of things. I think those are embedded forever. As I said, I think a good chunk of, students are never going to feel so great about going back to school in their lives as they will when this is over. But that's going to be because of the social connectivity. But I think this notion of remote learning is going to be embedded in a way that no amount of marketing could have done. We're going to figure out by painful learning what worked and didn't. That's going to be a whole nother boom area. I think the types of online entertainment and online socialization, way past Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and the rest, you're going to see a whole new set of apps emerge during this social isolation time. And I think logistics and delivery are being tested in a way that no one could have predicted. And surprisingly, I think it's holding up pretty well. We talk about shortages of face masks and ventilators, but we've yet to see, and again, I might be out of touch, but we have yet in the US to see shortages of food and regular supplies for daily living, and testament to our logistics system. So I think there are going to be some real changes in how business operates and how education happens, how medicine happens when the recovery comes, and how entertainment happens. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. You mentioned the social. And one thing I've kind of noticed too is that when you do go into this kind of social isolation, you realize that things like Facebook and Twitter were just add-ons to the life experience. They weren't replacements for it. So now when you're in isolation, you really do miss the community. The tech has not really got a solution for that yet. I could look at something like Zoom, where you get a whole group of friends and you're all looking at each other, but it's kind of like that's really going to be open virgin territory, I would think, to help people connect in an entirely different way than we've used for the last 10 years in social media.
Yeah, I think the experiment, though, has kind of taught us is that as much as we'll connect online, people still want to see each other, physically. There's something magic about that. And we're running a giant social experiment that proves that. Yes, all those apps kind of allow us to connect, but we're discovering it's not the same as being in a room full of people or partying with a room full of people. And while you could kind of get that virtual experience, something about the human brain says, no, I need to see or feel or hear them face to face. It's a great experiment. Not one you could have ever ethically done before, but we're doing it now.
We had missed the initial wave here in Vietnam. It had really not spread down to Southeast Asia. And then in March, European travelers coming to Southeast Asia started bringing it to Thailand and Vietnam and Singapore, et cetera. And that's where we went into kind of a heavier lockdown. So for me, for example, as a guy who likes to go to yoga classes, it really messes with your mind. I'm able to control my stress pretty good. I'm pretty introverted to begin with, but it really does mess with your mind when you have those things taken away from you. And I just, again, to extrapolate out and not make that about my own little personal gripe, but to extrapolate that out, that level of isolation and stress, that could end up being, as you kind of hinted earlier, a major, major opportunity as how to help so many people that are really going to be in trouble with their own mind.
Yeah, I just think this whole idea of remote therapy and making people feel a little more connected. And some people have different reactions to being locked up. And there's a difference between being locked up by yourself, with yourself and a partner, or yourself and now a bunch of kids running around who are also climbing the walls. I think people need to consider that being able to talk to other people about your problems are always important, but probably this type of isolation is creating more stress and probably requires more counseling and more help. And I'm not sure companies or individuals themselves kind of are understanding that. Everybody thinks that your own problems are just your own problems, not that they're kind of commonly shared problems.
Steve, you've got a great write-up on your blog at steveblank.com about this topic, very detailed. You've also got a new Harvard Business Review piece out, I believe. Is there anything that I did not bring up today that you really wanted to accentuate or talk about, something that I missed that's really near and dear to your thinking right now?
Yeah, well, I'm a speed and urgency kind of guy, meaning you're going to come to 90% of the conclusion in 10% of the time. You could either decide that you want every piece of data, and sometimes that makes sense when, in fact, there's no consequence in waiting. Let's say you were building a new factory. Well, let's make sure we get all the data about cost and customers and demand and whatever versus now where this is going to happen to you if you don't act. In this case, having sufficient data about, well, is this going to kill 1 million people or 10,000 people, or how long is the lockdown going to be, or is it going to affect my state or my particular industry? In most cases, waiting is going to be a real mistake. You need to act. And so that's the other piece I would just emphasize is whether you're a startup, a nonprofit, a small business, or even a large company, you need to take action. That's the piece that maybe didn't come across. It's very rare that you can't rehire. By the way, the other corollary to this, as I said, they're on the high side. There are businesses that are booming. Some portions of e-commerce and some portions of enterprise software and delivery are doing great. And I hate to act like, again, a vulture, but there's going to be world-class talent available that you never, ever could have hired or acquired. If you do have cash and your business is booming, now's the time to overstock talent you never could have gotten, because there will be a recovery and those people will get jobs elsewhere. But if they're sitting around and you go, well, our hiring plan says, well, screw your hiring plan, grab up assets that there's only a few of. These are not plug replaceable assets. So world-class people, world-class facilities, world-class other assets, if you have the cash and you could acquire them, now's the time to do that.
You know, your main article that we were going to talk about today was the virus survival strategy for your startup. I think we've covered a lot of that, but you're really giving a virus survival strategy for anyone involved in business. It's beyond just startup. The thinking is wise for all of us.
Well, I think the thinking is just simply, how do you act in a crisis? One of the things that I used to cringe every time I'd hear it, I don't think people were being stupid or glib, but I just think they were being a little tone deaf, is making the distinction between a peacetime and wartime CEO and saying, now's the time for a wartime CEO. People usually make those analogies or people have never served because being in a war, if you screw up in a war, it's not like your salary gets cut or you lose your job. It's measured and killed in action, whether it's you personally or people under your command. What people haven't served don't understand, if you're on the tip of the spear in the Army or Marines, you train for the fight continually. The first time you end up in a battle is not the first time you've practiced for a battle. And why I make that distinction is we didn't practice for the fight. Every CEO today did not practice for the economy crashing around them. To say you need to be now a wartime CEO leaves the most important part out, is that, yeah, well, if you're in a war, you've been practicing for being in a war your entire career. If you're a CEO today, you've been practicing to be a peacetime CEO. Either your MBA or your on-the-job experience or whatever has practiced you for processes and procedures to grow and scale your company, not what happens when it's about to crater.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're going to strike a chord with folks. People are going to, if they're looking in the mirror, they're going to say, well, hold on. I've just had a 10-year fun run of good times. And now I got someone giving me a kind of punch to the gut. Steve's giving me a punch to the gut, the sober message of like, hey, that time's not here anymore.
And more importantly, you haven't trained for it. It doesn't mean you're not capable of learning, but I just want to point out the reason why it seems for a good number of CEOs and C-level staff disconcerting is this isn't the battle drill you've run. If you haven't simulated or practiced this multiple times to say, okay, let's pull the plan off the shelf because we've run through this. This is scenario 12. No, you kind of go, where was this in the Harvard case study? The economy shut down, your suppliers are gone, blah, blah, blah. Your employees are like disappearing. Whoa, where's that? And so because you haven't had any practice, it's hard to be biased for action. But if you're in a wartime situation, you are biased for action or else you die. And that's the kind of why I'm emphasizing the speed and urgency. The equivalent is you now need to be biased for action, not biased for committee or consensus. That's the major distinction here.
You know, I was thinking as you're talking about preparation, I was thinking back to my grandmother. She probably died about 10 or 15 years ago. She was 94. So I can remember growing up in the 70s, being at her house. Her husband had died, my grandfather, when she was quite young before I was born. I'd go to her basement, and her basement had shelves and shelves of stuff, canned goods, et cetera, et cetera. a kind of living that we don't do today, being prepared for hard times. And I think this will probably also, I would guess, at least for those folks that want to be robust, is going to reforce us to imagine how we do prepare for the next one in terms of cash, other things we might need to survive.
That lasts for a little while, and then most people kind of like go back to their old behaviors. Here in California, when we had a major earthquake in 1989, for the next 5 or 10 years, is people would talk up earthquake preparedness and run drills and whatever. And after 5 or 10 years, that kind of wears off, and people start building out on the mudflats, right, where the ground will liquefy, and zoning kind of gets relaxed again, and all that stuff that people stocked up, and they don't even remember where the supplies are. But geology doesn't care whether you remember or not. There will be another quake. The difference is people, I think after this for a couple of years will kind of be on guard and whatever. But unless you build that into your culture, and that's, again, the military trains for the fight because that's their job. It's kind of hard for companies unless you build simulations for, and some industries do, disaster drills, or God forbid, we now train for shooter on campus drills because we've gotten unfortunately used to that in the States. But unless you constantly drill and it doesn't disappear over time, it's hard to keep that up. And you almost always find the reasons that people cut out this practice. Oh, it costs too much money, or this is too much time, or gee, look at all this empty land, we should be building here. And I've lived through enough of this to kind of go, yeah, people will remember for a while and then eventually they forget. But those things don't forget. They come back. Earthquakes will still happen and crashes will still happen. And our whole economy was wired for the most of the 20th century to kind of stop a repeat of the crash of 1929. Then we started taking down all those barriers. No, banks could be investors, and yeah, it's okay to kind of do this and do that. And people kind of forgot because there's more money to be made. And since our democracy is a coin-operated democracy, the people with the money kind of figured out how to change the rules again. And I think we're going to see that here too. I guess I'm not optimistic that people will learn from this. Ironically, the people who are best prepared today are the preppers. People have been preparing for the apocalypse. I'm not sure they predicted a man-made apocalypse, but they're the ones with the canned food in the basement and meals ready to eat for 6 months, etc. But a good stock of guns and ammo. I don't think we're going to need the guns and ammo, or the grocery stores are still open. But there was some small segment of the population who was preparing.
Well, I hope if there's anyone listening to us in one of those abandoned missile silos somewhere in Idaho or Montana, they reach out, because I want to see pictures of their prepped situation. Steve, great stuff. I think it's a great reminder, great sobering reminder. I think the most key words that I take away: survival, nimble. It's here. Deal with it. Take action. People can find your work. They can find a more detailed write-up than we've even covered today at steveblank.com. And as I mentioned, the Harvard Business Review. Anything else you wanted to drop on everybody, Steve?
Again, with all the doom and gloom, it really isn't doom and gloom. It's just simply observe, orient, and decide and act. It's what the military calls OODA loop. It's time to do that, or it will happen to you. And then just remember, we will all come out of this. If we do the right thing, we'll all come out, and your family will come out, and people you love and care about and responsible for will come out on the other side healthy and safe. And hopefully you can help them do that.
By the way, I like that you said not only doom and gloom, because ultimately on the other side, there is opportunity.
Huge. And there's opportunity now as well. It's just that if you're running an existing business, you need to take action.
Steve, I appreciate you coming on today.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.